Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Olympic National Park, Washington, October 2011. The phone shattered Chris Brennan's sleep at 6:47 a.m., its harsh digital trill cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of his ranger station cabin. He fumbled for it, knocking over a half-empty mug of yesterday's coffee, the cold liquid spreading across paperwork he'd meant to file a week ago. Olympic National Park, Ranger Brennan. The woman's voice came through fractured, desperate. My daughter, she's gone. We camped at Hoh River and she went to the bathroom last night and... A sob interrupted the flow of words. She never came back. It's been 9 hours. 9 hours. Chris was already pulling on his uniform pants, phone wedged against his shoulder. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What's your daughter's name? Sophia. Sophia Martinez. She's 16. She had her flashlight, but God, I should have gone with her. I should have. Mrs. Martinez, listen to me. Where exactly were you camped? The Hoh River campground, Site 14. Please, you have to... The other rangers said she probably just got turned around, but it's been 9 hours. The emphasis carried a weight that settled in Chris's gut like a stone. He grabbed his radio, his SAR pack already half assembled from muscle memory. I'm organizing a search team right now. Stay at your campsite. We're going to find her. But even as he said it, something cold and familiar coiled at the base of his skull. The Hoh rainforest. Of course it was the Hoh. By 8:15 a.m., Chris stood at the trailhead with 4 other rangers, the morning mist so thick it turned the towering Sitka spruces into shadows, their massive trunks disappearing 15 feet up into white nothing. The air tasted green and ancient, heavy with moisture that didn't feel quite like rain. Standard grid search, Chris said, spreading a topographic map across the hood of his truck. Jake, you take the Hoh River Trail north to Mineral Creek. Sarah, sweep the campground perimeter and eastern tree line. Mike, work the riverbank downstream. Tom, you're with me heading toward the old logging routes. Tom Whitfield, a ranger half Chris's age with exactly 3 months on the job, looked at the map and frowned. There's no logging routes marked here, because they're not official trails anymore. Chris folded the map with practiced precision. But they're there. Trust me. What he didn't say. I've seen what happens when people wander onto those routes after dark. The Martinezes were exactly what you'd expect from a family whose world had just collapsed. The father's hand shaking so badly he couldn't hold his coffee. The mother's eyes red and swollen and fixed on the tree line like Sophia might materialize if she just stared hard enough. Their younger son, maybe 12, sat in the camping chair looking small and lost. She took the flashlight from the tent, Mrs. Martinez said for what Chris suspected was the 100th time. She said she'd be right back. That was 10:45 p.m. I waited 15 minutes and then I went looking, but I couldn't find her. The ranger station said to wait until morning because people get found in the morning, right? They said that. But what if... Mrs. Martinez, I've been working this park for 12 years. The lie came easily. 11 years, actually. He'd taken a year off in 2003. After. We have protocols and they work. Sophia's probably sheltering somewhere dry, waiting for daylight just like we told her to in the safety briefings. Except the Hoh didn't work like other forests. Chris had learned that the hard way. The old logging road revealed itself gradually, the way forgotten things do. A depression in the earth that might have been intentional, saplings growing in 2 parallel lines where wheels had once compressed soil too hard for roots to penetrate easily. Moss covered everything, thick and impossibly green, muting the world into soft edges and muffled sounds. Tom kept checking his GPS. This thing is acting weird, says we're in 3 different locations. Canopy interference, Chris said automatically, though his own GPS showed the same problem. The satellite reading jumped between coordinates half a mile apart, settling nowhere. They'd been walking for 40 minutes when Tom stopped abruptly. Is that... A jacket hung from a branch at shoulder height, bright purple against the endless green. Chris's radio crackled to life before he could move. "Chris, it's Sarah. I've got Sophia's jacket at the eastern perimeter. Purple north face. Family confirms it's hers." Chris stared at the identical jacket in front of him. Purple north face, size small, same yellow zipper pull shaped like a star. "Copy that," he said slowly. "Bag it and mark the location." Tom was already reaching for the jacket on the branch. "Shouldn't we? Don't touch it." The sharpness in Chris's voice made Tom's hand freeze mid-reach. "Call in the coordinates first. Photos from multiple angles. Then we bag it." But Sarah already found her jacket. "I know what Sarah found." While Tom radioed in their discovery, confused and probably thinking his supervisor was losing it, Chris studied the jacket without touching it. No tears, no dirt, no moisture, despite the omnipresent dampness that made dry things nearly impossible in the hoe. It looked like it had been placed there 5 minutes ago, hung with care on a branch that barely supported its weight. His radio came alive again. This time it was Jake's voice, tight with confusion. Chris, I've got a purple jacket here at Mineral Creek. North face. Family says it matches what Sophia was wearing." The forest seemed to tighten around them, the mist pressing closer. "How many jackets was she wearing?" Tom tried to joke, but his voice cracked halfway through. Chris keyed his radio. "All teams fall back to base camp now." "But we've barely started." "Now, Tom." Because Chris had seen this before, 8 years ago. Different forest, different victim. The objects appearing in impossible locations. The disorientation that went beyond getting lost. The way the trees seemed to lean inward, attentive and hungry. The way reality started coming apart at the seams. Back at the command tent they'd erected near the Martinez campsite, Chris laid out all 3 jackets on a folding table. Identical. Same wear patterns on the elbows. Same faded patch on the left shoulder where a band logo had been imperfectly removed. Sarah had even checked. Same loose thread on the right pocket. "This is impossible," Jake said, which was the wrong thing to say because it implied there was something possible about any of this. Chris's hands were steady as he examined each jacket, but inside, the careful walls he'd built over 8 years were starting to crack. "Did anyone see footprints near where you found these?" "Moss doesn't hold prints well," Sarah said. "You know that." "Did you see any disturbance? Broken ferns, scuff marks, anything?" They all shook their heads. Mr. Martinez had been watching from near the coffee station. Now he approached, moving like a man in a dream. "What does this mean? How can there be 3 jackets?" Chris could have explained it away. Manufacturing defects, family brought multiple jackets, stress playing tricks on memory. But he'd tried lying to himself before, and it had cost someone their life. "Mr. Martinez, I need you to tell me everything Sophia said before she left the tent. Exact words if you can remember them." "She said..." He struggled to focus. "She said she heard something. Music, maybe. Or singing. She wasn't sure. She thought it might be from another campsite." The cold thing at the base of Chris's skull tightened its grip. "What kind of singing?" "She said it sounded like a lot of people. All singing together, but not. She said it didn't match up right. Different songs at the same time." Mr. Martinez's face crumpled. "I told her it was probably just sounds carrying weird in the fog. I told her to hurry back. I should have." "You did everything right," Chris said, and meant it. Against something like this, doing everything right wouldn't have mattered. He pulled Tom aside while the other rangers tried to calm the family. "You ever hear stories about this area? Local legends, that kind of thing?" "I'm from Oregon, man. Just transferred here in July." "The logging camps," Chris said quietly. 1890s. There were 3 camps in the Hoh Valley. Clear-cut operations back when they didn't care about sustainable forestry. In February 1893, a storm came through like they'd never seen. Not snow, just rain and wind. Lasted 4 days. When it was over, all 3 camps were gone. 247 men. They never found most of the bodies. Tom's face had gone pale. "That's just a story though, right?" Historical accident. The camps were in different valleys, miles apart. The storm hit all three at exactly the same time. 10:45 p.m. on February 17th, same minute. Jesus, that's when Sophia. I know. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. You think the forest is, what, haunted? Chris wanted to say no, wanted to give the kid the comfortable lie of a rational world where forests were just trees and mist was just water, and missing girls were found cold and scared but alive. Instead, he said, I think we need to expand the search to the old camp ruins, and I think we need to do it fast. The ruins weren't on any official map, but Chris had found them years ago during his own desperate search, the one he never spoke about. They followed the logging road deeper into the Hoh, the forest growing darker despite the climbing sun, the mist never quite burning off. Tom kept his hand on his radio like it might protect him. How do you know where you're going? The GPS is completely fried now. Muscle memory. Another lie. The truth was, Chris could feel the ruins pulling at him, the same sickness in his gut that had led him here before. Like the forest knew what he was looking for and was eager to show him. They found the first remnants after 90 minutes. Rotted beams half consumed by moss, rusted saw blades grown into tree trunks. The metal and wood fused over decades into something that wasn't quite natural and wasn't quite manufactured anymore. The trees here grew differently, twisted around the forgotten camp in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And then he saw Sophia. She stood 30 yards ahead, purple jacket bright against the green, her back to them, perfectly still, not shivering despite the cold, not looking around, just standing there like she was waiting for something. Sophia, Tom shouted, relief flooding his voice. Sophia Martinez. She didn't turn. Chris grabbed Tom's arm before he could run forward. Wait. What? We found her. She's... Look at her shadow. The mist was thick, but not so thick that a 16-year-old girl shouldn't cast some kind of shadow in the filtered morning light. Sophia cast none. She stood on the moss-covered ground as if she weighed nothing, disturbing nothing, connected to nothing. Sophia, Chris called out, keeping his voice level. Can you hear me? The girl turned, and Tom made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a scream. Her face was Sophia's face. The photo from the missing person report, 13-year-old features, Hispanic heritage in her dark eyes and hair. But it was also not. Something in the expression was wrong. Too blank. Too waiting. Found me, she said, except her voice overlapped with itself. Dozens of versions speaking the same words at infinitesimally different moments, creating a sound like a choir out of sync. You found me, found me, found me. Tom had his radio out, hands shaking. Base camp. This is Tom. We've located... The Sophia thing tilted its head at an angle that human necks didn't quite accommodate. Where were you? Where were you? Where were you? We waited. So cold, so cold, so cold. The rain never stops, never stops, never stops. Behind her, the mist began to coalesce into shapes. Dozens of them. Men in period clothing that hung in tatters, faces pale and waterlogged, mouths open in mid-shout or mid-scream or mid-prayer. All moving independently but also synchronized like a film played on multiple projectors slightly out of alignment with each other. The loggers, all 247 of them, or whatever was left of them after 118 years of being lost and angry and confused. If this story has grabbed your attention so far, consider following for more quality content. What would you do in Chris's situation? Run or try to help? Share your thoughts below. Chris's vision was starting to fracture at the edges, the forest multiplying into overlapping versions of itself. He'd seen this before, felt reality starting to come unglued, his mind unable to process the impossible and starting to shut down in self-defense. But this time he had Tom with him. This time he couldn't afford to break. They're not ghosts, Chris said, his voice steadier than he felt. Not exactly. Something happened to them in that storm, something that trapped them between moments, between states. They're confused, reaching out, and Sophia got too close. How do you know that? Tom's voice was climbing toward panic. Because 8 years ago I lost my partner the same way. We were doing a night search in Gifford Pinchot. Found him 3 days later. He was wrong. Said things that didn't make sense. Showed up in multiple locations at once. When we finally got close enough, he turned into this. Chris gestured at the approaching collective. This fracture. And I ran. I left him there and I ran. And they never found him. The Sophia thing stepped closer and Chris could see tears running down her face. Her real face underneath whatever the collective had wrapped around her. The real Sophia, still in there, still aware. Help, 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 she whispered in that awful overlapping voice. I'm so lost, lost, lost. Can't find my way. Tom had his knife out, which would have been funny if everything wasn't so terrible. What do we do? Chris pulled out his flashlight, though the morning was bright enough. He'd learned this the hard way. The collective existed in a temporal fracture, stuck in that February night in 1893. They didn't see the daylight that Chris and Tom saw. They were still experiencing the storm, the darkness, the rain that had consumed them. We give them what they never got, Chris said. A way out of the dark. He clicked on the flashlight, the LED beam cutting through the mist. Then he started walking toward Sophia, toward the collective, every instinct screaming at him to run like he'd run before. This is insane, Tom hissed, but he clicked on his own flashlight and followed. The effect was immediate. The overlapping figures stopped their advance, dozens of faces turning toward the lights like plants toward the sun. Chris could hear them now, really hear them, not just the overlapping voices but the individual words underneath. Confusion, fear, desperation. We're here to help, Chris called out, projecting his voice through the fractured space. You're lost, we know, but we can guide you back. Back, back, back? The collective spoke through Sophia's mouth. No back, no back, no back. Only forward, only dark, dark, dark. Chris was close enough now to see Sophia's real eyes tracking behind the collective's influence, aware and terrified. Listen to me, he said, speaking directly to her, ignoring the collective. Sophia Martinez, your mom is waiting at campsite 14. Your dad and your brother, they're waiting for you. You're not alone. The collective recoiled as if burned. Alone, 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 all alone, 247, and alone, alone, alone. And Chris finally understood. They weren't trying to hurt Sophia. They were trying to not be alone. Trapped in that moment of dying together, they'd reached out to anything that came close, pulling it into their fractured existence. Not malicious, just desperately, eternally lonely. You don't have to be, Chris said. He could feel the collective's attention focusing on him now, hundreds of desperate minds turning toward his voice. We remember you. The camps, the storm. We tell your story. You're not forgotten. It was a small lie. The logging camps were a footnote in park history, barely remembered. But Chris said it with enough conviction that it became true in that moment. Not forgotten? The voices were separating, becoming individuals. Never forgotten. And you don't need her. Chris held out his hand to Sophia. Let her go home. She has people waiting. Don't trap someone else in your darkness. For a long moment, nothing moved. The forest held its breath. Then the Sophia thing shuddered and the real Sophia stumbled forward, collapsing into Chris's arms. She was freezing, hypothermic, her lips blue and her breathing shallow. But she was her again, solid and real and singular. The collective stood where she'd been, their forms solidifying for just a moment into distinct individuals. 247 men with faces and names and histories that had been lost to time. Chris saw recognition in some of their eyes. Gratitude, maybe. Or just relief that someone finally saw them as more than a mass of confused spirits. Then the mist swallowed them, and they were gone, not destroyed. Chris could still feel them in the forest, woven into the ancient trees and the endless green. But no longer reaching, no longer quite so desperate. Tom carried Sophia most of the way back while Chris radioed ahead for medical support. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about cold and music and voices that wouldn't stop singing their different songs. The doctors would call it severe hypothermia and exposure. Chris wouldn't correct them. Mrs. Martinez's scream when they emerged from the tree line was the sound of a world being put back together. She and Mr. Martinez ran to meet them, and Chris stepped back to let them have their moment, the reunion he'd been denied 8 years ago. Sarah appeared at his elbow. The other 2 jackets disappeared. They were right there on the table, and then they just weren't. "Yeah," Chris said. "That happens." "That's it? That happens? Chris, what the hell did you and Tom find out there?" He watched the Martinez family, watched Sophia beginning to cry in her mother's arms, watched the father's hands finally steady as he stroked his daughter's hair, watched them become whole again. "We found her," Chris said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." The paperwork called it a successful rescue following standard SAR protocols. Sophia had gotten disoriented in the dark, fallen and hit her head, sheltered in a fallen log until the search team located her. The medical evaluation supported the narrative. Mild concussion, stage 2 hypothermia, some confusion and short-term memory loss consistent with head trauma. No one mentioned the jackets. No one asked why Sophia's last clear memory was of being surrounded by men in old-fashioned clothes, all singing different songs at the same time. 3 days later, Chris returned to the old logging camp ruins alone. The mist was lighter in the afternoon and the forest felt different, still ancient and strange, but not quite so hungry. The collective was still there. He could sense them, but they weren't reaching anymore. He found a flat stone and carved something into it with his knife. Just a simple message. 242 men lost. February 17th, 1893. Not forgotten. He placed it among the rotted beams and rusted saw blades, a marker that probably no one would ever see. But maybe the collective would know. Maybe it would matter. Tom requested a transfer to the visitors center 2 days after the rescue. Chris didn't blame him. Some people weren't built for the parts of the job that didn't make it into the manual. Chris stayed because someone had to, because the Olympic National Park sprawled across nearly 1 million acres, and the Ho was just one valley among many. Because there were other places in the park where reality felt thin, other stories of people who went missing and came back wrong or didn't come back at all, because 8 years ago he'd run, and he'd spent every day since trying to make up for it. On his day off, Chris drove out to the coast, to the stretch of Olympic Beach, where the forest met the ocean. He sat on the driftwood logs and watched the waves, letting the sound of the surf drown out the overlapping voices that sometimes still echoed in his head. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Thank you for bringing our daughter home." The Martinez's, Chris typed back, "Just doing my job," then deleted it. Typed, "I'm glad she's safe," then deleted that too. Finally, he just wrote, "Take care of each other." The sun was setting, painting the Pacific in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too vibrant to be real. Chris thought about temporal fractures and collective consciousness in forests that remembered every person who'd ever died within them. He thought about the difference between ghosts and echoes, between malice and desperation. Mostly he thought about Sophia Martinez, alive and recovering, learning to reconcile whatever she'd experienced with a world that would tell her it was just head trauma and hypothermia and shock. He hoped she'd be okay. He hoped she'd find a way to make sense of it that didn't involve losing herself to the memory. He hoped that when the forest called to her again, because it would eventually, it always did, she'd be strong enough to recognize the difference between help and hunger. The waves crashed against the shore, indifferent and eternal. Chris finished his coffee, cold now in the evening air, and drove back to his cabin. There would be another call eventually, another missing person, another chance to do it right. And maybe next time, he wouldn't have to remember what it felt like to run. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, please consider following for more compelling stories. What's your interpretation of what really happened to Sophia in the forest? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The call came at 4:47 a.m. and Daniel Harper knew before answering that sleep was finished for the night. 23 years as a forest ranger had given him an instinct for emergencies. The way his Nokia's ring seemed sharper, more insistent when something was genuinely wrong. Olympic National Park, Ranger Harper speaking. Please, the woman's voice cracked immediately. My daughter, Madison Reynolds. She went hiking yesterday on the Hoh River Trail and she was supposed to call last night and her phone just goes to voicemail and... Daniel reached for his notebook, his hand steady despite the familiar tightness forming in his chest. Ma'am, I need you to slow down. When exactly did your daughter enter the park? Yesterday morning, around 9. She texted me at noon saying the forest was beautiful, and then... nothing. It's been almost 17 hours. 17 hours. The number settled into Daniel's stomach like a stone. In Olympic's rainforest, 17 hours could mean hypothermia, injury, disorientation, or worse. What's your name, ma'am? Carol Reynolds. We're from Portland. Madison's a sophomore at Reed College. She's studying environmental science and she wanted to see the temperate rainforest before winter term started. She's experienced. She knows how to hike. She wouldn't just... Carol, I'm going to find your daughter. The words came automatically, a promise he'd made dozens of times. Usually he kept it. What was she wearing? As Carol described Madison's red North Face jacket, her blue backpack, her brown hiking boots, Daniel filled 3 pages with details. Height, 5'6". Weight, 130. Distinguishing features, small scar above left eyebrow from childhood accident. Last known position, somewhere along the Hoh River Trail between the visitor center and 5 Mile Island. After hanging up, Daniel sat in his small ranger station office staring at the topographic map of Olympic National Park spread across his desk. The Hoh River Trail snaked through some of the densest temperate rainforest in North America. Sitka spruce towering 300 feet high. Western hemlocks wrapped in moss so thick it muffled sound. A cathedral of green that blocked out the sky. Beautiful, ancient, and easy to get lost in, even for experienced hikers. His eyes traced the trail's path and his hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his left forearm. 7 years since the Quinault incident. 7 years since he'd found Emily Bridger's body, what was left of it, in a hollow cedar stump 3 miles off the trail. 7 years since he'd heard the voice calling his name from empty forest, seen shadows move against the light, felt that particular quality of wrongness that had nothing to do with weather or wildlife. The official report said Emily had suffered exposure and wild animal predation. Daniel's unofficial opinion, the one that had earned him a 3-month administrative leave and mandatory counseling, suggested something else entirely. He'd stopped talking about it after the psychiatrist's 3rd session, learned to nod and agree that trauma could cause auditory hallucinations, that grief and exhaustion could make a person see things that weren't there, learned to keep his mouth shut and his observations to himself. But he'd never stopped knowing what he knew. Daniel grabbed his gear bag, checking contents by muscle memory. First aid kit, emergency blanket, rope, water filtration tablets, flares, GPS unit, radio, headlamp, extra batteries. His personal additions, iron nails in a small pouch, a silver compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a leather-bound journal filled with 7 years of careful notes. Outside, the pre-dawn air hung thick with moisture. November in Olympic meant rain, not the dramatic downpours of summer thunderstorms, but a persistent drizzle that worked its way through every layer of clothing. The parking lot lights created halos in the mist, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called. Daniel drove his Park Service truck toward the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, arriving just as gray light began filtering through the canopy. The parking lot held only 4 vehicles. A silver Honda Accord with Reed College stickers, Madison's presumably, a battered pickup belonging to Mike Torrance, another ranger, and 2 tourist vehicles. Mike was waiting by the trailhead, a thermos of coffee in his hands. At 63, he was a fixture at Olympic, with a face weathered by decades of Pacific Northwest weather and a reputation for finding lost hikers. Heard the call on the radio, Mike said, offering Daniel a cup. 19-year-old solo hiker out of contact since yesterday noon. That's right. Daniel accepted the coffee, grateful for the warmth. Weather yesterday was stable. No storm warnings, no flash flood risk. Trail conditions good. She should have been fine. Mike paused. Unless she went off trail. Or unless something found her. The words came out before Daniel could stop them. Mike's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of recognition, maybe concern. Daniel, I know what I sound like. Daniel handed back the empty cup. I'm going in. You coordinate from here, check with any hikers coming out. You want backup? Not yet. Let me do an initial sweep first. The truth was, Daniel preferred searching alone. Easier to trust your instincts when you didn't have to explain them to someone else. The Hoh River Trail began innocuously enough. A well-maintained dirt path wide enough for two people to walk side by side. But within 50 yards, the forest closed in. Sitka spruce rose like pillars in a cathedral, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so dense that daylight became a suggestion rather than a reality. Everything was green, moss covering every surface, draping from branches, carpeting fallen logs that served as nurse trees for new growth. The air itself seemed green, filtered through layers of chlorophyll. Daniel moved at a steady pace, eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. Fresh footprints in mud, broken branches, torn clothing, dropped equipment, anything. At the 1-mile marker, he found the first trace, a granola bar wrapper tucked under a fern, the packaging still bright against the damp earth. Nature Valley oats and honey. He bagged it carefully, noting the location on his GPS. The forest pressed close on all sides, muffling the sound of the Hoh River rushing somewhere to his left. In summer, this trail teemed with tourists. In November, Daniel had it to himself. Just him and the trees and the oppressive silence. At 2 miles, the trail split, the main path continuing toward 5 Mile Island, a smaller path branching toward the river. Daniel stopped, studying the junction. Footprints in the mud, fresh enough to have been made yesterday. Boot treads matching the description Carol had given for Madison's hiking boots. The prints headed toward the river path. Daniel followed. The path narrowed, becoming less maintained. Roots crossed the trail like tripwires. The sound of the Hoh River grew louder, and through gaps in the trees, Daniel caught glimpses of gray-green water moving fast over river stones. And then he heard it. "Help!" The voice came from ahead and to the right off the trail. Female. Young. Weak. Daniel's hand went to his radio. "This is Harper. I've got a possible contact with the missing hiker. Approximately 2.3 miles in river access path. Heading off trail to investigate." Mike's response crackled back. "Copy that. Proceed with caution. I'm notifying search and rescue to stage." Daniel moved toward the voice, pushing through sword ferns and salal, his boots sinking into ground so saturated it squelched with every step. The forest here felt different, older somehow. The trees grew in strange formations, twisted and leaning, their roots exposed like grasping fingers. "Help me." Closer now. Definitely female. Coming from a small clearing ahead where a massive Sitka spruce had fallen, creating a gap in the canopy. Pale November light filtered down, illuminating a red shape against the moss. A red jacket. North Face. Madison's jacket. Daniel approached carefully, his heartbeat loud in his ears. "Madison Reynolds?" The figure didn't move. He circled around, coming at the clearing from a different angle. And that's when he saw. The red jacket lay crumpled on the ground, empty. No body inside. Just the jacket, arranged almost carefully atop a bed of moss. Daniel froze, every instinct screaming. "Help me, please." The voice came from behind him now. He spun, hand on the canister of bear spray at his belt, but saw nothing except trees and ferns and shadows. "Madison?" His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the forest. "Daniel," his blood turned to ice. The voice, it was his own voice calling his own name from somewhere in the trees. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Daniel's situation? Share your thoughts below. Daniel backed toward the clearing, keeping his eyes on the forest. His hand found his radio. Harper to base. I found the subject's jacket, but not the subject. Situation is... He paused, weighing his words. Situation is unusual, requesting immediate backup. Copy, Harper. What do you mean by unusual? How to explain it? How to say that he'd heard a voice calling for help that led him to an empty jacket, that he'd then heard his own voice calling his own name from empty forest? He couldn't. Not without triggering another psychological evaluation, another round of mandatory counseling. Just send backup, Daniel said, and bring thermal imaging if you've got it. He approached the red jacket carefully, using a stick to lift it. Definitely Madison's. He could see her Reed College ID card still clipped to a pocket. No signs of violence, no blood, no tears, no indication of struggle. Just a jacket, removed and placed almost reverently on the moss. Daniel's fingers found the leather journal in his pocket. 7 years of notes. 7 years of patterns he'd observed but couldn't prove. Missing hikers whose belongings were found arranged in small clearings. Rescue teams who reported hearing voices calling from empty forest. Search dogs that refused to track beyond certain points, whining and pulling away from invisible barriers. The Quinault incident had been the worst. Emily Bridger, 24 years old, experienced backpacker. They'd found her 3 days after she went missing, and Daniel had been first on scene. He'd heard her voice calling for help, had followed it to that hollow cedar stump. What he'd found inside had ended his sleep for months and filled pages of his journal with desperate attempts to understand. The official report said exposure and predation. But Emily's body had been desiccated, withered like she'd been dead for months rather than days. And her face had been twisted in an expression of such pure terror that Daniel had needed 3 tries before he could call it in on the radio. The psychiatrist said trauma could distort memory, that Daniel's mind might have exaggerated what he'd seen as a defensive mechanism. But Daniel had taken photos. He'd documented everything. And when he'd tried to show the photos to his superiors, they'd been corrupted. Just gray static on his camera's memory card, as if something had reached in and erased the evidence. Daniel Harper, his name again, in his own voice, but wrong somehow. The cadence off, the tone not quite matching the way he actually spoke. I know what you are, Daniel said to the empty forest. I've seen what you do. The forest offered no response except the distant rush of the river and the whisper of wind through moss-draped branches. Daniel secured Madison's jacket in an evidence bag and began a systematic search of the clearing, documenting everything with his camera. No signs of struggle, no disturbed earth, no indication that Madison had been here at all except for the jacket. His radio crackled. Harper, this is Torrance. Backup is 15 minutes out. Do you have visual on the subject? Negative, just the jacket. I'm expanding search perimeter. Daniel moved in widening circles from the clearing, looking for footprints, broken branches, any indication of direction. The forest seemed to resist him. Every path looked the same, every tree identical to the one beside it. His compass swung lazily, not quite settling on north. That's when he noticed the trees. A stand of young hemlocks, maybe 30 feet tall, arranged in a perfect circle. No, not quite perfect. The circle had a gap, an opening facing southeast, toward the river. Daniel had spent 2 decades in these forests. He knew growth patterns, understood how trees competed for light and space. This formation was wrong, intentional. He stepped into the circle. The temperature dropped immediately. Not the gradual chill of evening, but an instant plunge that raised gooseflesh on his arms. The ambient sound changed too. The river's rush faded to a distant murmur. The wind ceased. Even his own breathing seemed muffled. In the center of the circle, someone had arranged stones. Not randomly. A deliberate pattern, spiraling inward like a nautilus shell. And at the spiral's center, a small pile of personal items. A hair tie, a Reed College student ID, a silver bracelet, Madison's belongings. Daniel photographed everything, his hands shaking slightly. This was it, the evidence he'd needed 7 years ago. the proof that something beyond natural explanation stalked Olympic's forests. He reached for his radio. It wouldn't turn on. He tried his cell phone. No signal, not unusual in the deep forest. But the phone itself wouldn't power up despite showing a full battery when he'd left the truck. His GPS unit was dead too. Even his digital watch had stopped, the display frozen at 8:42 a.m. Clever, Daniel muttered. He pulled out his grandfather's silver compass. The needle spun wildly for a moment, then fixed on a direction, not north but toward the gap in the hemlock circle, toward the river. Daniel had a choice. Wait for backup, maintain protocol, report the findings through proper channels, or follow the trail while it was still fresh, before whatever had taken Madison moved her again. He thought of Carol Reynolds waiting by her phone in Portland. He thought of Emily Bridger's mother, who still sent him Christmas cards every year thanking him for finding her daughter, never knowing what condition he'd actually found her in. He thought of the 7 years he'd spent documenting and investigating and trying to understand a predator that left no tracks except the empty shells of its victims. Daniel stepped through the gap in the hemlock circle. The forest changed, not dramatically. No sudden transition into nightmare landscape, but subtly in ways that made Daniel's trained eye notice immediately. The moss grew thicker, almost luminescent in the dim light. The trees leaned inward, their branches interlacing overhead. The air smelled different, still damp earth and rotting vegetation, but underneath it, something else. Something like ozone and copper and decay. The path, if it could be called that, led downward toward the river. Daniel moved carefully, one hand on the rough bark of trees for balance. His boots slipped on moss-covered stones. Water dripped from branches overhead, each drop sounding unnaturally loud in the muffled atmosphere. He'd gone maybe 200 yards when he heard Madison's voice again. "Mom? Mom, I'm here, I'm okay." This time, Daniel recognized the trick. The voice had Carol Reynolds' inflection, but it came from Madison's throat. A perfect imitation of the daughter calling to her mother. The entity was learning, adapting, using the information it gathered from its victims. "Madison Reynolds," Daniel called out, his voice firm. "This is Forest Ranger Daniel Harper. If you can hear my voice, make a sound. Any sound." Silence. Then, "Daniel, help me. Please, Daniel, it hurts." Emily Bridger's voice. Exact intonation, exact pitch. The same word she'd gasped out 7 years ago when he'd found her in that hollow cedar stump, her body already withering, her eyes clouded and unseeing. Daniel's scar throbbed. The phantom pain he'd carried for 7 years suddenly sharp and immediate, as if the entity was reaching across time to remind him of their first encounter. "I'm not afraid of you," Daniel said, which was a lie. He was terrified. But he'd learned that showing fear fed this thing, strengthened it somehow. The trees opened onto a small beach beside the Hoh River. Gray water rushed past, carrying debris from upstream. And there, at the water's edge, stood Madison Reynolds. She faced away from Daniel, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She wore only a t-shirt and jeans. No jacket, no backpack, no boots. Her feet were bare and pale against the dark river stones. "Madison?" The figure didn't turn. Daniel approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run, to go back, to get back up. But he'd learned something in 7 years of investigation. This entity fed slowly. It took time to fully consume its victims, time to drain whatever essence it needed from them. If Madison was still standing, still physical, there might be a chance. "Madison, my name is Daniel Harper. I'm a forest ranger. Your mother sent me to find you." The figure's head tilted slightly, bird-like and wrong. "She's very worried about you," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. "Carol, your mom. She called me at 4:47 this morning, frantic because you hadn't checked in." Madison's shoulders moved. A shudder, or maybe a sob. "She told me about your environmental science major at Reed, about how excited you were to see the temperate rainforest. She's waiting for you, Madison. She wants you to come home." "Home," Madison whispered. Her voice sounded hollow, echoing like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "I don't remember. Where is home?" Daniel was close enough now to see the back of her head, her dark hair matted and tangled with bits of moss and cedar. Close enough to see that her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, that her breathing seemed too shallow, too slow. "Home is Portland," Daniel said gently. "With your mom. Do you remember Portland, Madison?" Portland. The word came out slowly, as if Madison was tasting it, testing it. "I remember rain, bookstores, Powell's. I love Powell's." "That's good, Madison, that's really good. I'm going to come stand next to you now, okay? And then we're going to walk out of here together." He moved alongside her, carefully avoiding any sudden movements. When he finally saw her face, it took all his training not to react. Her eyes were clouded, milky white like Emily Bridger's had been. Her skin had that same desiccated quality, as if she'd aged decades overnight. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her fingernails blackened, but she was conscious. She was speaking. She was still fighting. "It showed me things," Madison said, her voice that hollow echo. "Beautiful things. My grandmother, she died when I was 12, but I saw her again. She was in the forest, and she said she'd been waiting for me. She said she had so much to show me." "Your grandmother wasn't in the forest, Madison. Whatever you saw, it wasn't her. I know that now." A single tear tracked down Madison's withered cheek. "It keeps showing me people. My mom, my roommate, my high school boyfriend. They all come out of the trees and tell me to follow them. And I do. I keep following them deeper and deeper, and when I catch up, they turn around and they have no faces. Just smooth skin where their faces should be." Daniel's journal had 17 similar accounts. Hikers who'd survived encounters reported being lured by familiar voices, seeing loved ones who led them astray. The entity fed on connection, on trust, on the human need to find comfort in the familiar. "How long have you been here, Madison?" "I don't know. Days, hours. It all blurs together. Sometimes I'm standing at the river like this, and sometimes I'm somewhere else, a dark place, underground maybe. And I can feel it feeding. Not on my body, but on something inside. My memories maybe, or my sense of self. Every time I come back to the surface, I remember less. I know my name, but I can't picture my mother's face anymore. I know I go to school, but I can't remember what I'm studying." The entity was consuming her identity, Daniel realized. Slowly draining everything that made Madison herself, leaving behind an empty shell that it could wear like clothing. "We're leaving," Daniel said firmly. "Right now, I'm going to take your arm. It won't let me go. I don't care what it will or won't." "Daniel," Madison finally turned to look at him with those clouded eyes. "It's not showing me loved ones anymore. It's showing me you. Multiple versions of you. You're standing in the trees all around us, watching. Some of you are smiling. Some are just staring. There are dozens of you." Daniel's skin crawled. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Empty. But he understood what Madison was seeing. The entity was learning from him now, studying him, preparing to add him to its collection. "How many people?" Daniel asked quietly. "How many has it taken?" "I don't know. I've seen remnants, pieces of people in that dark place, fragments of memories that aren't mine. A woman who loved classical music, a man who missed his children, a girl who was afraid of storms. They're all still here, Daniel. Everyone it's ever consumed. Still conscious somehow, still aware, trapped in..." Madison's body jerked suddenly, violently. Her head snapped back, mouth opening in a silent scream. Her clouded eyes rolled up, showing only whites. "No, no, no." Daniel grabbed her arm, steadying her. "Stay with me, Madison. Focus on my voice. Think about Powell's bookstore. Think about your mother. Think about anything real, anything concrete." "It's pulling me back," Madison gasped. "I can feel it, like hooks in my mind pulling me down. It knows you're here. It's excited. It hasn't had a ranger in years. It wants..." Her voice cut off mid-sentence. Her body went rigid, then completely limp. Daniel barely caught her before she collapsed onto the river stones. He checked her pulse. Weak, thready, but present. Her breathing was shallow. Her skin felt cold, far too cold for someone who'd been walking and talking moments ago. Daniel lifted Madison's slight frame and started back toward the trail. Immediately, he knew something was wrong. The path he'd taken to reach the river, it was gone. The gap in the hemlock circle had closed or moved or never existed. In every direction, identical forest, moss-draped trees, sword ferns, ancient growth that all looked exactly the same. His grandfather's compass spun uselessly. Daniel had been in Olympics backcountry hundreds of times. He knew how to navigate by landmarks, by sun position, by terrain features. But here, every landmark looked identical. The sun was invisible behind the canopy. The terrain gave him no information. He was lost. No, not lost. Deliberately confused. The entity was manipulating his perception, making him walk in circles, keeping him contained until it could finish with Madison, and then turn its full attention to him. "All right," Daniel said to the empty forest. "I get it. You're powerful. You're in control here, but I'm not playing your game." He set Madison down gently, propping her against a fallen log. From his gear bag, he pulled out the pouch of iron nails. Old folklore, iron-repelling supernatural entities. He'd never been sure if it actually worked or if it was just superstition, but he'd carried the nails for 7 years, just in case. Daniel arranged them in a circle around Madison, points facing outward. A makeshift barrier. Protection. He added his grandfather's compass to the circle's center along with his journal, physical anchors to reality, to the world outside this predator's influence. Then he stood and walked directly toward the densest part of the forest. "You want me?" Daniel called out. "Here I am. Let's finish what we started at Kino." The forest rippled. Daniel had no other word for it. The trees seemed to shimmer and shift, their bark flowing like water, their branches reaching and grasping. The moss glowed with faint bioluminescence, and from every direction, voices called to him. His mother, dead for 15 years. "Danny, sweetheart, come home." His ex-wife. "We can work it out, Daniel. I miss you." Emily Bridger. "Help me, please, it hurts so much." And underneath all of them, a sound that wasn't quite sound, a vibration felt in bones and teeth, a frequency just below perception that made his eyes water and his stomach clench. The entity was dropping its pretense, showing itself, or as much of itself as Daniel's human perception could process. Shadows coalesced between the trees, not cast by anything physical, but existing independently. They moved like oil on water, flowing and reforming. Within the shadows, Daniel caught glimpses of faces, dozens of faces, maybe hundreds, everyone the entity had ever consumed, their identities trapped and preserved like insects in amber. And there, Emily Bridger, younger than when he'd found her, her face still bright and full of life. She opened her mouth and Madison's voice came out. "It remembers you, Daniel. It's been waiting for you to come back." "Why?" Daniel demanded. "What are you? What do you want?" The shadows pulsed. Multiple voices answered simultaneously, creating a discordant chorus. Sustenance, connection, memory. We are what remains when everything else is forgotten. We are the dark beneath the roots, the cold at the world's heart. We are old, so old, and so hungry. You're feeding on people's identities, their sense of self. We preserve them. They live forever within us, their memories, their loves, their fears, all cherished and maintained. Humans are so afraid of being forgotten. We remember. We hold them safe in darkness. Daniel's scar throbbed. The entity had tried to take him at Kino, had started the process. But something had interrupted it. Another ranger arriving, maybe. Or simply Daniel's pure, stubborn refusal to let go of himself. He'd escaped partially consumed, carrying a piece of the entity's influence like a splinter under his skin. "You don't preserve them," Daniel said. "You trap them." Madison could barely remember her own mother. Memory fades regardless. At least within us some fragment remains. That's not living. That's not existence. And what is existence, Daniel Harper? The shadows flowed closer. "You've spent 7 years documenting us, studying us, trying to understand us. You're more connected to us than to your own species. You divorced. You have no children. You push away anyone who tries to get close. You're already half gone, already lost. Why not complete the journey?" It was true. All of it. Daniel had sacrificed relationships, stability, normalcy, and his obsessive need to understand this thing. He'd turned himself into a weapon aimed at a target he couldn't quite see, couldn't quite prove existed, but he hadn't forgotten why. "I'm here because a mother asked me to find her daughter," Daniel said. "Carol Reynolds. She called me at 4:47 this morning, terrified. She didn't call because I'm the best tracker or the most experienced ranger. She called because Olympic sent her to me. And I'm here because somewhere in the last 7 years of isolation and obsession and documentation, I never forgot what actually matters." Daniel pulled the flares from his gear bag. "You want to know what makes us human? What makes existence worthwhile? It's not memory. It's not preservation. It's choice. The ability to decide, every single moment, whether to give in to darkness or keep fighting. Madison chose to stay conscious, to keep fighting you even as you drained her. I choose to get her out of here." He ignited the first flare. Brilliant red light exploded through the forest, harsh and chemical and entirely unnatural. The shadows recoiled, hissing. "Iron and fire," Daniel said. "Old protections. You're ancient, but you're not invincible." He ignited the second flare and threw it into the densest concentration of shadows. The entity shrieked, a sound that made Daniel's ears pop and his vision blur. The shadows writhed and convulsed, faces appearing and disappearing within their mass. The forest snapped back into normal configuration. The hemlock circle reappeared to Daniel's left, its gap facing exactly where he'd left Madison. The river's sound returned, loud and immediate. His compass stopped spinning and pointed true north. Daniel ran. Madison was still propped against the log, still unconscious but breathing. Daniel scooped her up and plunged through the hemlock circle, ignoring the temperature drop, ignoring the way the trees seemed to lean inward and grasp. He clutched the third flare in his free hand, ready to ignite it if the shadows returned. The forest fought him. Roots appeared where none had been moments before. Branches snagged his clothing. The ground became slick and treacherous. But Daniel had navigated Olympic's backcountry for 2 decades. He knew how to read terrain, how to find the path even when the forest tried to hide it. His radio crackled to life. "Harper, this is Torrance. Do you copy? What's your location?" "Torrance," Daniel gasped out between breaths. "I've got her. Subject is alive but unconscious. I'm heading back to the main trail now." "Copy that. We've got search and rescue staged at your last known position. Can you give us coordinates?" Daniel checked his GPS. It powered on immediately, showing his position clearly. 2.7 miles from the visitor center, off the river access path. "I'm 200 yards north of the stone spiral," he said, knowing Mike would understand the reference from his years of experience in the forest. "Roger, stay on the line. We're coming to you." Behind Daniel, the shadows gathered one last time. He could feel them, a cold pressure at his back. Emily Bridger's voice drifted through the trees. "You can't save them all, Daniel. We'll still be here. We'll always be here. And someday, you'll come back to us." "Maybe," Daniel muttered. "But not today." He burst onto the main trail just as Mike Torrance appeared with 3 search and rescue personnel. They surrounded Daniel immediately, taking Madison from his arms, checking her vitals, radiating efficiency and competence. "Jesus," Mike breathed, looking at Madison's withered face. "What happened to her?" "Severe exposure and dehydration," Daniel said automatically. The official explanation. the one that would go in the report. Get her to the hospital. Life flight if possible. She needs IV fluids and warming protocols immediately. The search and rescue team worked quickly, loading Madison onto a stretcher. Within minutes, they were moving back down the trail at a jog, their radio communication echoing through the forest as they coordinated with the ambulance waiting at the visitor center. Mike stayed behind with Daniel, studying his face. You look like hell. I feel like hell. What really happened out there? Daniel considered lying, considered offering the same official explanation that would satisfy the reports and keep his job secure. But Mike had worked these forests for 40 years. Mike had seen things too, Daniel suspected. Things he didn't talk about because talking meant risk and scrutiny and disbelief. The same thing that happened to Emily Bridger, Daniel said quietly. The same thing that's been happening in Olympic for God knows how long. Mike was silent for a long moment. Then, I've been hoping I was wrong, hoping it was just coincidence, or my imagination, or, you're not wrong. Can it be stopped? Daniel thought about the shadows, the faces trapped within them, the entities claimed to be old and hungry and vast. I don't know, but it can be resisted. Madison fought it. I fought it. Maybe that's enough. They walked back toward the visitor center together, the forest slowly lightening as true morning arrived. By the time they reached the parking lot, full daylight had transformed Olympic back into a tourist destination. Beautiful, ancient, and seemingly benign. Carol Reynolds was waiting by the ambulance when they arrived, having driven from Portland the moment search and rescue called. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her face lined with worry. But when she saw the paramedics loading Madison into the ambulance, when she heard her daughter was alive, the relief that flooded her features made Daniel remember why he did this job. Thank you, Carol said, gripping Daniel's hand. Thank you for finding her. She's strong, Daniel said. She never stopped fighting. At the hospital in Forks, doctors stabilized Madison. She remained unconscious for 36 hours, but when she finally woke, she remembered everything. Too much, maybe. The psychiatrist noted signs of severe trauma and recommended long-term counseling. The official diagnosis was exposure-induced delirium with associated hallucinations. Daniel visited her once, 3 days after the rescue. Madison's eyes had cleared. No more cloudy whiteness. Her skin tone had improved. She looked like a normal 19-year-old recovering from a hiking accident. But when she saw Daniel, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, understanding. It's still there, she said quietly, once her mother had left to get coffee. In the forest, waiting. I know. What do? We live, Daniel said. We remember. We warn others when we can. We don't give it what it wants. What does it want? To be the only thing that remembers us after we're gone. Madison was silent for a moment. Then, there were others in that dark place. I felt them. They're still conscious, Daniel. Still aware, still trapped. I know. Can they be freed? I don't know, Daniel admitted, but I'm going to try to find out. He left the hospital and drove back to Olympic, back to his small ranger station, back to his journal filled with 7 years of observations and theories. He had more to add now, more evidence, more understanding. The entity would still be there, in the deep places of the forest. It would lure more hikers, consume more identities, add more faces to its collection. Daniel couldn't stop that, not yet, maybe not ever. But he could document it. He could warn people. He could be ready for the next call, the next desperate parent, the next chance to pull someone back from the shadows. At his desk, Daniel opened his journal to a fresh page and began writing. The November rain drummed against his window, and the forest beyond pressed close in the darkness, ancient and patient and hungry. But Daniel Harper was patient too, and he wasn't finished fighting. Thank you for reading to the end. If you appreciated this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of Madison's fate? Did she truly escape, or does she carry something with her still? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Chris Hayes found Daniel Kruger's campsite, and something about it was fundamentally wrong. Chris had been a ranger at Tongass National Forest for 11 years. He'd seen dozens of abandoned campsites, recovered bodies from crevasses, talked down suicidal hikers, and once spent 48 hours tracking a confused elderly man through a blizzard. He prided himself on his rationality, his systematic approach to search and rescue operations. There was always an explanation, always a logical chain of events that led from point A to point B. But Daniel Kruger's tent sat in a small clearing near Kuyu Island's northeastern shore, and nothing about the scene followed any logical pattern Chris had ever encountered. The tent itself was intact, properly staked, rainfly secured. Inside, Chris found Kruger's sleeping bag neatly rolled, his backpack organized with the precision of an experienced hiker. Food hung properly in a bear bag 20 yards away. Nothing was missing except Kruger himself, his boots, and his jacket. The GPS unit sat on top of the sleeping bag, still powered on, battery at 47%. The last waypoint marked was the campsite itself, logged at 11:47 p.m. 3 nights ago. What made Chris's skin prickle wasn't what was there, it was what surrounded it. The footprints started at the tent entrance. Daniel's boots, size 11, deep impressions in the mud heading north toward the shoreline. Chris followed them with his flashlight even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. The canopy here was so dense that twilight came early. The prints were clear, purposeful, the gait normal. Then, 30 yards from the tent, they simply stopped. Not faded, not obscured by rain or debris, just stopped, mid-stride, as if Daniel Kruger had been plucked from the earth by an invisible hand. Chris circled the area 3 times, expanding his search radius, looking for any sign of where the prints continued. Nothing. The undergrowth was undisturbed. No broken branches, no torn moss, no indication that anyone had veered off the path. The prints just ended in a small depression of mud, the last one showing the full outline of the boot, toes pointed north. He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Hayes. I'm at the Kruger site. Something's not right here." Static crackled. "Define not right, Chris." That was Sarah Mendez, the operations coordinator. Her voice always sounded tinny through the radio, but there was an edge to it now. "Prints terminate without explanation. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of animal activity. It's like he just vanished mid-step." A pause. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying I need more time here. There's something I'm missing, something obvious, there has to be." "Copy that, weather's deteriorating. You've got maybe 2 hours before the next storm cell hits. After that, we're pulling you out." Chris acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt. 2 hours. He'd need less than that. There was always an explanation. He returned to the campsite and began a methodical grid search, photographing everything, documenting each detail in his weatherproof notebook. That's when he found the second set of prints. They were smaller, barefoot, with an oddly elongated shape that reminded Chris of what? He crouched down, studying them in the beam of his flashlight. The prints were fresh, less than a day old based on the water accumulation. They emerged from the tree line to the east, circled the tent twice, then headed toward the shore, paralleling Daniel's boot prints but offset by about 6 feet. Chris's rational mind cataloged the observations. Human-shaped but wrong proportions, 2 long toes, weight distribution suggesting a strange gait, probably a hiker with deformed feet, maybe barefoot for some inexplicable reason. Except no one would go barefoot in Tongass. The temperature was hovering around 45 degrees, and the ground was a mixture of mud, sharp rocks, and decomposing vegetation. He followed the barefoot prints toward the shore, his breath forming small clouds in the damp air. The sound of waves grew louder, and through the trees, he could see the gray churn of the Pacific. The prints led him through a dense thicket of Sitka spruce, their branches heavy with moisture dripping constantly. Water ran down his neck despite his rain gear. His boots squelched in the saturated earth. Then he heard it. Chris. His name. Clear as day. A man's voice coming from somewhere ahead near the shoreline. Chris froze. Daniel? Daniel Kruger? No response. Just the rush of waves and the patter of rain on leaves. Daniel, if you can hear me, I'm Ranger Hayes. I'm here to help you. Nothing. Chris moved forward, more cautiously now, one hand on his radio. The barefoot prints continued ahead of him, becoming deeper, as if whoever made them had started running. And there, he stopped abruptly. There was blood, just a few drops, dark and fresh, splattered across a fallen log. Chris. The voice again, but this time it was behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Nothing but trees and shadows and the endless dripping of water. His heart rate had elevated. He noticed it clinically, the way he'd been trained. Increased pulse, heightened awareness, adrenaline response. Normal for a potentially dangerous situation. Identify yourself, he called out, his voice steady despite the cold knot forming in his stomach. Chris, help me, please. The voice was moving, circling around him through the trees, and now Chris recognized something that made his scalp tighten. It was his own voice. Not similar, not an impression. His exact voice, with the slight rasp he got when he was tired, with his Pacific Northwest accent, with the particular cadence he used when he was trying to stay calm. This isn't funny, Chris said, speaking to the forest, to whoever was out there mimicking him. This is a search and rescue operation. If you're interfering, you're breaking federal law. Laughter echoed through the trees, not his voice this time. Higher pitched, almost childlike, but with a wet, gurgling quality that made Chris think of drowning. He backed toward the campsite, keeping his flashlight moving, scanning the shadows. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him. Wildlife with unusual vocalizations, maybe a bird he didn't recognize, acoustic anomalies caused by the terrain and weather. But 11 years in Tongass had taught him every bird call, every animal sound. This was something else. The barefoot prints, the circling, the voice mimicry. And then, like a punch to the gut, Chris remembered the conversation he'd had with Tommy Brightwing 6 months ago. Tommy was Tlingit, a subsistence hunter who'd been coming to these islands his whole life. They'd shared coffee in Chris's ranger station during a storm, and Tommy had told him stories. Old stories. Stories about the Kushtaka. Land otter men, Tommy had said, his weathered face serious. They look like otters, but they can take human shape, half and half. They call to you in voices you know, voices you trust. They lead you to the water, and then, he'd made a gesture, fingers rippling like water. You drown, or worse, you become one of them. Chris had smiled politely, filed it under local folklore, and promptly forgotten about it. Because he didn't believe in monsters. He believed in bears, hypothermia, falling accidents, heart attacks, and human error. Not shape-shifting otter spirits. But now, standing in the mist with something calling his name in his own voice, Chris felt the foundations of his worldview beginning to crack. He made it back to the campsite and immediately began packing up Daniel's gear. Whatever was happening here, he needed to get back to base, regroup, come back with a full team in daylight. The logical thing to do. The safe thing. Don't leave me here, Chris. Daniel's voice this time. Young, terrified, breaking with sobs. I'm so cold. Please, I can't feel my legs anymore. The water's so cold. Chris's hands stopped moving. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, but he was a ranger. He'd taken an oath. If there was even a chance Daniel was alive, he had to try. Where are you? Chris called out, hating the tremor in his voice. The shore. I'm at the shore. Hurry, please hurry. Chris grabbed his medical kit and his flare gun, a last resort, but he wanted something more substantial than a flashlight, and headed toward the ocean. The light was fading fast now, the forest becoming a maze of shadows and mist. The sound of the waves grew louder, a constant roar that seemed to swallow all other sounds. He emerged onto a rocky beach. Gray water crashed against black stones, sending up plumes of spray. The tide was coming in and the beach was narrow, maybe 20 feet of exposed rock before the forest began. To his left, a massive Sitka spruce had fallen, its roots creating a small cave where land met water. Daniel? Here, I'm here. In the roots. I can't move. Something's wrong with my legs. The voice was coming from the fallen tree. Chris approached carefully, his flashlight beam probing the shadows beneath the root system. He could see something there. A shape, human-sized, partially submerged in the tidal pool that had formed in the depression. Hang on, Daniel. I'm coming. He climbed over the rocks, his boots slipping on the wet stone. The smell hit him then, a mix of rotting kelp, brine, and something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Chris reached the root cave and shone his light inside. The thing that looked back at him was not Daniel Kruger. It had Daniel's jacket. It wore Daniel's face or something approximating it, like a mask that didn't quite fit. But where the eyes should have been, there were black voids, deep and empty. And the mouth. The mouth was too wide, stretched in a grin that showed too many teeth, needle-sharp and overlapping. Its body was wrong, too. Partially human, partially something sleek and furred, with hands that ended in webbed fingers tipped with black claws. "Chris," it said in Daniel's voice, in his voice, in Tommy's voice, in a dozen voices all layered together. "Come into the water, Chris. It's warmer than you think. We're waiting for you. We've been waiting so long." Chris stumbled backward, his boot slipping on kelp. He went down hard, his flashlight flying from his hand and clattering across the rocks. The beam spun crazily, illuminating the thing as it began to crawl out of the cave, its movements liquid and wrong, more like an otter than a man, its two long limbs bending in ways that violated every law of human anatomy. "Stay back." Chris fumbled for his flare gun, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The kushtaka, because that's what it was, that's what Tommy had tried to warn him about, tilted its Daniel mask head, and that horrible gurgling laughter echoed across the beach. "You don't believe," it said in Chris's mother's voice, dead now for 5 years. "You never believed. But we're real, Christopher. We've always been real." And Daniel believed at the end. When the water filled his lungs, when we changed him, he believed. Chris fired the flare. The projectile streaked across the darkness, a miniature sun that painted everything in harsh red light. It hit the rocks near the creature, and the phosphorus ignited with a brilliant flare that drove back the shadows. The kushtaka shrieked, a sound like nails on slate mixed with the cry of a hunting eagle, and retreated into the water, moving with impossible speed. Chris saw its true form for just a moment in the flare's light. Something between an otter and a human, and neither, sleek and brown, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. Then it was gone, diving beneath the waves, leaving only ripples and that terrible smell. Chris didn't wait. He grabbed his flashlight, left the flare burning and ran. His training, his rationality, his systematic approach to problems, all of it evaporated in the face of primal terror. He crashed through the forest, branches whipping at his face, his breath coming in gasps. Behind him he could hear splashing, movement in the water, keeping pace with him along the shoreline. Voices called from the darkness. His father, his ex-wife, Sarah from base, all of them calling his name, begging him to stop, to help them, to come to the water. He made it to the campsite and didn't stop, just kept running south, following the trail he'd marked on his GPS, praying his batteries would last, praying the storm would hold off, praying to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago. The voices followed him for miles, always just behind, always at the edge of his vision. Shapes moved through the trees, sleek and quick, pacing him. When he splashed through a stream, he saw them in the water. Dozens of them, their otter-like forms swimming beneath the surface, their almost human faces grinning up at him. Chris ran until his legs gave out, until his lungs burned, until he collapsed on the trail 3 miles from the nearest ranger station. He keyed his radio with trembling hands. "Base, this is Hayes. Emergency extraction. Now. Kuyu Island, 3 miles north of Station 7. I repeat, emergency extraction." "Chris? Jesus, we lost your signal 2 hours ago. What happened? Did you find Kruger?" Chris looked back into the dark forest, where shapes moved between the trees, where voices whispered his name in a chorus of the dead and the missing. "No," he said. "I didn't find him. And you need to close the island. All of it. Don't send anyone else." "Chris, that's not... We can't just..." "Tommy Brightwing," Chris interrupted. "Get him on the radio. Ask him about the Kushtaka. Ask him about the old taboos, the ones we're not supposed to break. Ask him how many people have gone missing on these islands over the years. Really missing, Sarah. The ones where we never found bodies." Silence. Then, "Chris, are you injured? Did you hit your head?" He laughed, a sound that was dangerously close to the gurgling laughter he'd heard on the beach. "I'm fine. Perfectly fine. Except I just saw something that shouldn't exist. Something from a story. Something real. Helicopters en route. ETA 20 minutes. Can you hold position?" "Yes." Chris kept his eyes on the forest. The shapes were still there, watching, waiting. "But tell them to hurry. And tell them not to listen to any voices calling from the trees, no matter how familiar they sound." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Chris's life. He sat with his back against a tree, his flare gun reloaded, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist. The voices never stopped. His mother begged him to come home. His father told him he was proud. Sarah said there was an emergency at the base. He needed to come right now. Daniel Kruger screamed for help from a dozen different directions. Chris didn't move, didn't respond, just kept his eyes open and his weapon ready and waited for the sound of rotor blades. When the helicopter finally appeared, its spotlight turning night into day, Chris saw them clearly in the brilliant white light. Dozens of Kushtaka, standing at the edge of the clearing, their otter-like bodies upright, their almost human faces watching him with ancient, hungry intelligence. Some wore faces he recognized, missing hikers from over the years, people whose cases had gone cold, whose bodies were never recovered. And there, at the front of the group, wearing Daniel Kruger's face like an ill-fitting mask, was the thing from the cave. It raised one webbed hand in a gesture that might have been a wave, might have been a promise. Chris climbed into the helicopter without looking back. They found him 3 days later, the official report would say. Christopher Hayes, 11-year veteran ranger, suffering from severe dehydration, hypothermia, and what the psychiatric evaluation labeled as acute stress reaction with dissociative features. He'd been babbling about otter spirits and voices in the trees, about creatures that mimicked human speech, about old taboos and broken boundaries. They never found Daniel Kruger. The search was called off after 2 weeks. Equipment failure, they said. He'd probably fallen into the ocean, swept away by the current. It happened sometimes. Tragic, but not uncommon. Chris Hayes resigned from the National Park Service 6 weeks later. He moved to Arizona, as far from the ocean as he could get, to a place where everything was dry and exposed, and nothing could hide in the mist. But sometimes, on humid nights when the air is thick and the darkness complete, he hears voices calling his name. Familiar voices. Loving voices. Voices that promise warmth and rest and relief from the burden of knowing. And sometimes, just sometimes, he sees sleek shapes moving in pools of shadow, watching him with eyes that reflect light like an animal's, waiting with the patience of things that have existed since before memory, before maps, before men decided they could explain away everything with logic and reason. The Kushtaka are real. They've always been real. And now Christopher Hayes, the rational analyst who never believed in anything he couldn't measure and document and explain, knows what every Tlingit elder has known for thousands of years. There are places where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where ancient things still hunt, where the water calls with voices you trust, and the only thing protecting you from them is belief. Belief in the old warnings, the old taboos, the old stories that people like Chris Hayes dismissed as folklore. He believes now. God help him, he believes. But it's too late. Because the Kushtaka don't forget, and they never stop hunting. On Kuyu Island, in Tongass National Forest, Daniel Kruger's tent still sits in its clearing, maintained by the spirits as a lure, A trap, a promise of shelter that draws the unwary close to the shore. The Rangers avoid it now, though they won't say why. Tommy Brightwing knows. The elders know. And somewhere in the mist and the rain and the endless green of the Alaskan wilderness, the Kushtaka are singing. Singing in the voices of everyone who ever went into the water and didn't come back. Singing in the voices of mothers and fathers and lovers and friends. Singing, always singing. Waiting for the next person who doesn't believe. Waiting for the next person who will listen. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The ferry's diesel engine coughed twice before dying completely, leaving Christopher Brennan alone on the rusted dock with his equipment cases and a growing sense of irritation. The captain, a weathered man named Dutch, who'd said maybe 10 words during the 3-hour crossing from Copper Harbor, was already reversing away from Isle Royale's rocky shore, his boat's wake sending gray wavelets against the pilings. Ferry runs again in 5 days, Dutch had said, his only advice before departing. Weather holds. Chris watched the boat shrink against Lake Superior's slate-colored expanse, then checked his phone. 1 bar of signal, flickering. By tomorrow, it would be gone entirely. He'd been to dozens of remote research sites, but Isle Royale's isolation was uniquely absolute. A 45-mile-long island fortress surrounded by the world's largest freshwater lake, close enough to see Canada's distant shore on clear days, but utterly cut off from civilization. Perfect for the wolf-moose predation study he and Hannah had been planning for 8 months. Less perfect for the circumstances that had brought him here alone. Chris shouldered his pack and started up the trail toward Rock Harbor Ranger Station, his boots finding familiar purchase on the worn path. He'd been here twice before, knew the island's Byzantine trail system, understood its weather patterns and wildlife behavior. What he didn't understand, what made his jaw clench with scientific frustration, was why Hannah Reeves, his research assistant and former graduate student, had stopped responding to his messages 4 days ago, why the Rangers had found her camp in what they'd cryptically described as disturbing condition, and why Park Superintendent Sarah Blackwood had personally called him with a tone that suggested something beyond a typical missing person situation. The ranger station materialized through a screen of white pines, its log construction weathered silver gray. Sarah was waiting on the porch, her posture rigid. Next to her stood an older native man Chris didn't recognize, his deeply lined face framed by long gray hair tied back with red cloth. Dr. Brennan. Sarah's greeting lacked her usual warmth. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Where's Hannah?" Chris set down his equipment case. "Your message said she was missing, but I need specifics. How long since last contact? What's the search status?" Sarah exchanged a glance with the older man before answering. 4 days since she missed her scheduled check-in. We found her camp yesterday." She paused, choosing words carefully. "It's better if you see it yourself, but first, this is Joseph Ashkey. He's—" "Ojibwe elder," the man interrupted quietly, his eyes fixed on Chris with unsettling intensity. "I know why the woman disappeared. You will not believe me, Dr. Brennan, because you are a man of measurements and evidence. But I will tell you anyway, so when you see the truth, you might survive it." Chris felt his professional skepticism activate like armor. Over his 15-year career in wildlife biology, he'd encountered countless locals who attributed natural predation patterns to cryptids, who saw supernatural forces in simple animal behavior. He'd published 3 papers debunking supposed dogman sightings in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, had exposed a fake Bigfoot trail camera video that had gone viral, had built a reputation as the scientific community's go-to expert for separating folklore from fact. "Mr. Ashkey, I appreciate your concern, but I'm here to find my research assistant using established search and rescue protocols. If you have practical information about her last known location—" "Wendigo," Joseph said flatly. "The winter that walks. The hunger that cannot be satisfied." The word hung in the cool October air. Chris had heard it before, had even included a section about Wendigo mythology in his book, Apex Predators and Cultural Mythology. He'd been quite thorough in explaining how starvation-induced psychosis in isolated trappers had been reinterpreted through indigenous folklore into a cannibal spirit narrative. Wendigo is a cultural metaphor, Chris said with strained patience. A psychological phenomenon. Come see her camp, Sarah interrupted. Then we'll talk. The hike to Hannah's research site took 90 minutes, following the Greenstone Ridge Trail through forests already stripped half bare by autumn winds. Sarah maintained a brisk pace, her radio crackling occasionally with static distorted check-ins from other rangers conducting grid searches. Joseph followed silently, his presence somehow making Chris more uncomfortable than Sarah's obvious anxiety. They climbed through groves of birch and maple, descended into valleys thick with spruce, crossed rocky outcroppings that offered glimpses of Lake Superior's endless gray. Chris had walked these trails with Hannah just 6 weeks ago, plotting survey points, discussing wolf-pack territories, arguing cheerfully about statistical models. She'd been excited about this solo data collection stint, eager to prove herself capable of independent fieldwork. The memory made his chest tight. Hannah was 26, brilliant, cautious, not someone who made fatal mistakes in wilderness environments. Here, Sarah said finally, stopping at a trail marker. Her camp's another 100 yards off trail. I need to warn you. It's not what you'd expect from an experienced researcher. Chris followed her through thick underbrush into a small clearing that must have seemed ideal for a base camp. Relatively flat, near a creek, sheltered by old-growth pines. But the scene that greeted him made his analytical mind stutter. Hannah's tent stood intact, but the rest of her camp looked like it had been caught in a localized tornado. Equipment scattered in a perfect circle radiating from the tent's entrance. Solar chargers, cooking gear, specimen containers, all thrown outward with such force that several items were embedded in tree trunks. Her camp chair had been snapped in half and twisted into an impossible spiral. The fire ring stones were scattered, but the ground where they'd been was scorched in a pattern that resembled reaching fingers. Jesus. Chris approached slowly, his scientific training automatically cataloging details. What could do this? Bear? Storm? Bears don't arrange things in geometric patterns, Sarah said quietly. She was right. As Chris circled the destruction, he saw what his first shock had missed. The scattered equipment wasn't random. It formed concentric rings, each item placed at mathematically precise intervals, and carved into the bark of 7 surrounding trees were symbols that made his skin prickle despite his disbelief. They weren't scratches from bear claws or elk antlers. They were deliberate pictographs, humanoid figures with skeletal proportions and antlers, their mouths open in silent screams. Interspersed with these were more abstract symbols, spirals, inverted crescents, angular patterns that Chris recognized from his anthropology coursework as corrupted versions of Ojibwe protective symbols. The medicine wheel is backwards, Joseph said from behind him. The tobacco offerings are burned black. Someone or something has desecrated the sacred protections. Chris found his voice. These carvings could have been here for years. Hannah might have chosen this spot because of existing indigenous artwork. Look at the wood. Joseph cut him off. Fresh sap, cut within days. And read what your assistant wrote. Sarah handed Chris a waterproof field journal, open to the last entry. Hannah's normally neat handwriting had devolved into frantic scrawl. October 23rd, 2011, day 6. I'm not alone here. Whatever's been watching me isn't an animal. I've heard it whispering. Impossible because I'm miles from anyone, but I heard it. Heard. Whispers in a language that makes my teeth hurt. Found more signs this morning. Bones arranged outside my tent. Not deer or moose bones. Too long. Joints wrong. Tried to radio, but battery drained instantly. Fully charged yesterday. Something's draining the electronics. The solar panels won't charge. Phone dead. I need to... The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into a long scratch across the page. Chris flipped back through earlier entries, watching Hannah's mental state deteriorate day by day. She'd started confident, making detailed observations about wolf scat distribution and moose browse patterns. By day 3, she was noting strange feelings of being observed. Day 4 brought mentions of impossible tracks, humanoid but wrong proportions. 6-foot stride. Day 5 described finding a gutted deer hung upside down from a branch 20 feet high, its organs missing but no blood on the ground below. She was experiencing isolation psychosis, Chris said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sensory deprivation can cause... The deer is real, Sarah interrupted. We found it. Still there. You want to see it? 20 minutes deeper into the forest, they reached a massive oak where something that had once been a white-tailed deer hung from a branch no climbing predator could reach. The carcass had been split sternum to pelvis with surgical precision, emptied completely and the hide pulled back to expose ribs that gleamed white in the filtered sunlight. But most disturbing was the arrangement below. The deer's organs laid out on the forest floor in an anatomically correct display, as if something had carefully unpacked the animal to study its internal geography. Chris's scientific detachment finally cracked. This wasn't natural predation. It wasn't even human butchering. Wrong tools, wrong technique, wrong purpose. The precision suggested intelligence, but the total lack of practical reason suggested madness. Wendigo doesn't hunt for food, Joseph said, his voice heavy with resignation. It hunts because hunger is all it knows. Hunger that grows with each victim consumed, that can never be satisfied. Your assistant learned our stories were not metaphor. There has to be an explanation. Chris started, but his protest sounded hollow even to himself. There is. Joseph met his eyes. My people have known it for generations. In the hardest winters when starvation strips away humanity, some cross the line into forbidden sustenance. They eat the flesh of their own kind, and in doing so, they invite the Wendigo spirit, or become it themselves. There are conflicting interpretations, but the result is the same. A thing that was human becomes something else, something that grows taller and more skeletal with each victim, that moves faster than any natural animal, that whispers in the old language to draw more prey, Chris wanted to argue, to cite statistics and animal behavior studies to explain this rationally. But his throat had gone dry, because Hannah's journal had mentioned whispers, and because he'd felt it too since arriving on the island, that crawling sensation of hostile observation, of being sized up by an intelligence that calculated and planned. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Chris's place? Sarah's radio crackled. Blackwood, this is Patterson. Found something at the abandoned mine site. You need to see this. They hiked north toward the old Minong copper mine, abandoned since the 1870s, but still scarring the landscape with open shafts and collapsed structures. Chris's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. Hoax, cult activity, serial killer. Anything but the impossible explanation Joseph offered so calmly. The mine entrance yawned before them, a black mouth in the hillside, timber supports rotted and sagging. Ranger Patterson waited outside, her face pale. There are bones, she said without preamble. A lot of bones. And... She swallowed hard. Something moved down there. Something big. Sarah unclipped her maglite. Stay here, Patterson. Dr. Brennan. Joseph. You coming? Every rational instinct screamed at Chris to refuse, but Hannah might be down there, injured, hiding, needing rescue. He clicked on his headlamp and followed Sarah into the dark. The mine shaft descended at a steep angle, the air growing colder with each step. Their lights carved narrow tunnels through absolute blackness, revealing rusted rails and deteriorating support beams. The smell hit Chris 30 yards in, a combination of rot and something sharper, almost chemical. Decay and disease. There, Sarah breathed, her light finding the tunnel floor. Bones. Dozens, no, hundreds of bones, arranged in radiating patterns that covered the mine floor like macabre artwork. Deer, moose, wolves, and scattered among the animal remains, human bones. Skulls with the tops removed. Femurs cracked open lengthwise. Rib cages split and splayed. Chris felt his scientific worldview crumbling. This wasn't natural. This wasn't even psychopathic human behavior. It was too extensive, too old, too organized. The bone arrangements extended back into darkness beyond their light's reach. How many people? Sarah whispered. Years of people, Joseph answered. Decades, perhaps. The island's history includes many disappearances. Hikers, researchers, park employees, most attributed to falls, drowning, exposure. But some, he gestured at the ossuary, some fed the hunger. A sound echoed from deep in the mine, not wind, not structural settling. A whisper, but impossibly loud. Words in a language Chris didn't know, but that sent primal terror flooding through his nervous system. The sound of it made his vision blur, made his heart trip over itself. And then movement, far back where their lights barely penetrated, something unfolding from the darkness rising to impossible height. Run, Joseph said calmly. Run now and do not look back. Some things cannot be faced, only survived. They ran. Chris's headlamp beam bounced wildly as he scrambled up the shaft, his pack slamming against tunnel walls, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him he could hear it, footsteps that covered impossible distances with each stride, whispers that seemed to come from inside his own skull, and underneath it all, a sound like cracking bones and tearing meat. They burst into afternoon sunlight and kept running, following Sarah as she led them off trail into thick forest. Chris's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but terror kept him moving because something was coming behind them, and his rational mind had finally completely accepted that natural law didn't apply. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, finally collapsing in a dense stand of pines. Sarah immediately grabbed her radio. All units, evacuate the island. This is not a drill. Code Black. Emergency evacuation. What's Code Black? Chris gasped. It means the park is closed due to immediate lethal danger, Sarah said grimly. It means I'm admitting we have a problem we can't solve with conventional methods. Your assistant is alive, Joseph said suddenly. The Wendigo keeps some alive. Food for later when the hunger rises again. It marks them, claims them, keeps them in the deep places. Chris's hope and horror warred. Where? Where would it keep her? The old mining complex has deeper shafts, flooded tunnels, places humans cannot reach without equipment. Joseph's eyes were sympathetic. You understand what I'm saying, Dr. Brennan? You cannot save her. You can only choose whether to die trying. There has to be a way to kill it. Chris heard the desperation in his own voice. You said your people have stories. There must be traditional methods, weaknesses. Fire, Joseph said quietly. Wendigo fears fire because its spirit is cold hunger, but you would need to trap it. And it is faster and stronger than you can imagine. The old stories tell of warriors who sacrificed themselves to burn Wendigo and their host together. Martyrs who saved their tribes. I'm not a warrior, Chris said. I'm a biologist who studies wolf shit and collects moose browse data. This isn't... I can't... His phone buzzed. Impossible. There was no signal this deep in the island. But the screen had lit up, displaying a text message from Hannah's number. Help me, Chris, I'm so cold it's taking pieces, please help. Then another message, Mine Shaft 7 underwater section, it keeps whispering, I can't think anymore, please. And a final message that made his blood freeze. It's hungry again. Chris looked up to find Sarah and Joseph watching him. She's alive. She's texting me. The Wendigo is texting you, Joseph corrected gently. Using her phone, drawing you in. It has learned human tools, human communication. It has had many years to study its prey. I don't care. Chris surprised himself with the vehemence. She's my responsibility, I brought her here. Sarah grabbed his arm. Dr. Brennan, Chris, you can't save someone from something that shouldn't exist. The best thing we can do is get off this island and come back with what? Firepower. This isn't something we can shoot. But Chris was already digging through his pack, taking inventory. Waterproof matches, emergency flares, a diving headlamp he'd brought for underwater vegetation surveys, his knife, rope. And in the ranger station, he knew, were diving tanks, because the Park Service occasionally had to retrieve drowning victims or inspect underwater trail sections. I can reach the flooded shafts, he said. If I'm fast, if I'm smart. If you're lucky, Joseph interrupted. But luck runs thin in the presence of such creatures. However, the elder studied Chris with new respect. You have courage. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless. I will help you, though I am old and cannot run far. I know the traditional preparations, the tobacco offerings, the sacred words, A shriek split the forest, so loud and wrong that birds exploded from trees half a mile away. It was human and animal and neither, a sound of rage and hunger, and something that might have been laughter. It knows we're discussing it, Joseph said calmly. It knows you're planning, and it's excited. You'll be the most interesting prey it's had in years, Dr. Brennan. An unbeliever forced to believe. Delicious irony for a creature that understands human nature intimately. They made it back to the ranger station as twilight turned the forest into a maze of shadows. Sarah dispatched her remaining rangers to the harbor, ordering everyone onto the emergency response boat. She would stay with Chris, she insisted, though he could see the fear in her eyes. The three of them prepared through the evening. Chris reviewed the mine complex maps identifying Shaft 7's flooded sections. Sarah gathered diving equipment, flares, rope, emergency beacons. Joseph performed rituals Chris would have mocked 48 hours ago, burning tobacco, speaking prayers in Ojibwe, marking stones with symbols Chris now recognized as protective wards. These may help, Joseph said, hanging a small leather pouch around Chris's neck. They may not. The Wendigo is strong because belief makes it strong, and you still doubt, Dr. Brennan. Even now, part of you looks for scientific explanations. I'm trying to believe, Chris said. What I saw in that mine, you saw evidence, but you haven't accepted the reality. Until you do, you'll be vulnerable. Joseph's weathered hand gripped Chris's shoulder. When you face it, and you will face it, remember that Wendigo was human once. Deep inside, buried under hunger and corruption, there's still a spark of what it was. That's what makes it so terrible. It remembers being human, remembers love and warmth and fullness, but can never return to those feelings. Only hunger remains. They reached Mine Shaft 7 at midnight, under a moon that turned the forest silver and black. The shaft entrance was partially collapsed, opening onto stairs that descended into water black as oil. Chris adjusted his diving equipment, checked his waterproof flashlight, tied the rope around his waist. You have 1 hour of air, Sarah said. If you're not back in 90 minutes, I'm sending for help and leaving. Understand? Chris nodded, unable to speak past the terror clawing at his throat. He'd done dozens of dives, had underwater rescue training, knew proper safety protocols, but every instinct screamed at him to run, to get off this island, to forget Hannah and save himself. Instead, he stepped into the water. It was shockingly cold, driving the breath from his lungs. He descended the submerged stairs, his light cutting through water that seemed to actively resist illumination. At 30 feet, the stairs ended at a flooded tunnel. He checked his compass, northeast, according to the maps. He began swimming, following a passage barely wide enough for his tanks. The tunnel branched repeatedly. Chris marked each turn with glow sticks, leaving a trail back to the entrance. At 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. His light found rusted mining equipment, broken ladders, and Hannah. She was chained to a support post, her body submerged to the shoulders, only her head above water. Alive but wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her skin too pale, her lips moving constantly in whispered syllables. As Chris's light found her, she focused on him with terrible clarity. Chris. Oh God, Chris, you have to go. It's here. It's always here. It's in the water with you. He swam toward her, already working to free the chains. Old iron, rusted but still strong. He'd need to cut. Movement in the water. Not current. Not fish. Something massive displacing water, circling just beyond his light's reach. Chris fumbled for his knife, began sawing at the chains. Hannah was crying, her whole body shaking. It whispers all the time, she sobbed. Tells me about the hunger, about how I'll taste, about how you'll taste. It's been studying us, Chris, studying humans. It knows everything we fear. The water around them grew colder. Chris's breath came in panicked gasps through his regulator. The chains were giving way, but too slowly, too slowly. A hand closed around his ankle. Not a human hand, too large, fingers too long, grip impossibly strong. Chris screamed into his regulator as he was dragged backward, away from Hannah, away from air and light and sanity. He twisted, slashing with his knife, and his blade connected with something solid. The grip released. In his flashlight's beam, he saw it. The Wendigo had been human once. Chris could see that in its general structure. Bipedal, roughly humanoid proportions. But starvation and corruption had stretched it into a caricature. 12 feet tall, skeletal. Its skin pulled tight over bones that jutted at wrong angles. Its skull was elongated, jaw distended, filled with teeth that had grown through the gums at random angles. Antlers sprouted from its head, but they were malformed, growing inward as well as outward. Its eyes were the worst. Still human in shape, but filled with a hunger so profound it seemed to pull at Chris's soul. And it was smiling. Chris reversed direction, grabbing Hannah's chains with both hands, pulling with adrenaline-fueled strength. The chain snapped. He grabbed Hannah, held her close, triggered his emergency ascent beacon. The Wendigo moved through water like a shark, impossibly fast. It was between him and the exit, blocking escape, herding him deeper into the mine. Chris made a decision born of pure terror and desperate courage. He grabbed the waterproof flares from his belt, pulled Hannah toward a support beam, and began wrapping them together with rope. The Wendigo watched, curious, intelligence gleaming in its terrible eyes. "You like to study us," Chris gasped. "Study this." He ignited all 6 flares simultaneously, flooding the chamber with burning magnesium light. The Wendigo shrieked, that same horrible sound from the forest, and thrashed backward. Fire, its ancient fear, magnified underwater into boiling violence. Chris grabbed Hannah and swam, following his glow stick trail, lungs burning, muscles screaming. Behind him he could hear the Wendigo recovering, pursuing, whispers filling the water like blood from a wound. But ahead, light. Sarah had lowered emergency lights into the shaft entrance. Chris broke surface, gasping, and hands grabbed him, pulled him up the stairs. He managed to keep hold of Hannah, who was unconscious but breathing. They ran through the forest as behind them the mine shaft erupted with steam and rage. The Wendigo emerged, but dawn was breaking, and Joseph stood at the shaft entrance, speaking words in Ojibwe, holding burning sage. The creature hesitated, ancient instinct warring with hunger. "Go!" Joseph commanded, though whether he spoke to Chris or the Wendigo was unclear. "This is not your time. Return to the deep places." The Wendigo regarded them with eyes that held terrible intelligence. Then it turned and descended back into the mine, its whispers fading into the earth. They reached the harbor as the emergency boat arrived. Chris carried Hannah aboard, wrapped her in emergency blankets, held her as she shook and whispered fragments of Ojibwe prayers she couldn't possibly have learned. The boat pulled away from Isle Royale's rocky shore, and Chris watched the island recede into morning mist. "She'll recover," Sarah said quietly. "Physically. The rest..." She didn't finish. Chris looked down at Hannah. She'd stopped shaking, but her eyes remained unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. Or perhaps seeing things that were always there, invisible to those lucky enough to maintain their comfortable disbelief. Joseph had stayed on the island, too old for the boat journey, he'd said. But Chris suspected the truth. Someone needed to maintain the wards, to speak the prayers, to remember what slept in the deep places. 3 days later, back in his university office, Chris tried to write his report. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unable to commit to either truth or lie. The university expected a rational explanation. Hannah suffered from isolation psychosis, he could write. She'd fallen into an old mine shaft, experienced hypothermia and delirium. He'd performed a standard rescue. Case closed. But at night, when he closed his eyes, he heard whispers in a language that made his teeth ache. He saw impossible hunger in eyes that had once been human. And he knew with terrible certainty that Joseph had been right. The Wendigo wasn't unique. There were other places, other hungers, other corruptions of humanity into something far worse. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Thank you, just those 2 words. Could have been Hannah, finally recovered enough to use her phone. Could have been Joseph, using borrowed technology, or could have been something else. Something that had learned human communication over decades of studying prey. Something expressing gratitude to the skeptic who'd finally learned to believe. Chris deleted the message, closed his laptop, and poured another drink. Outside his window, the November darkness pressed close. And somewhere in that darkness, in mines and forests and forgotten places, hunger waited for the next victim who didn't believe in old stories. Because the Wendigo was patient, the Wendigo was smart, and the Wendigo was always, always hungry. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Robert Hayes had built his career on a simple premise. Everything has an explanation. For 12 years, he'd made comfortable living exposing fraudulent psychics, debunking haunted houses, and writing scathing articles that reduced ghost hunters to punchlines. His blog, Skeptic's Scalpel, had over 200,000 followers who enjoyed watching him dismantle supernatural claims with surgical precision. He'd never met a paranormal phenomenon he couldn't explain with logic, psychology, or simple trickery. That confidence carried him through the fog-shrouded parking lot of Olympic National Park's Hoh Rainforest Trailhead on a gray October morning in 2009. Lauren Mitchell's parents had hired him after the official search had been scaled back. Their daughter, a University of Washington doctoral candidate in anthropology, had vanished 6 days earlier while researching Coast Salish shamanic practices. The local authorities suspected she'd gotten lost or injured on the notoriously disorienting trails. Her parents suspected something else, something they were too frightened to name. Rob suspected neither. He suspected Lauren had staged her disappearance for attention, or possibly suffered a mental health crisis. Graduate students under pressure did strange things. He'd seen it before. The park ranger who'd agreed to guide him, a lean Quileute man named Marcus, watched Rob unload his gear with unconcealed skepticism of his own. "You're the guy who wrote that article about the Maca burial ground hoax," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Guilty." Rob hefted his backpack. "Saved the tribe a lot of embarrassment when I proved those ancient curses were just teenagers with spray paint and theatrical skills." Marcus's expression didn't change. Lauren Mitchell wasn't a teenager playing games. She was serious about her research. Too serious. What does that mean? Means she was asking questions about things people around here don't discuss with outsiders. Marcus started down the trail without waiting for a response. She wanted to know about the winter dances, the Sexwexwe masks, the transformation rituals. Rob followed, his boots squelching in the perpetual mud. The Hoh Rainforest was unlike any forest he'd ever seen. A primordial tunnel of enormous Sitka spruce and western hemlock draped in club moss and ferns. Everything was green, wet, alive. The canopy blocked most of the sky, creating a cathedral dimness even at mid-morning. And people told her about these rituals? Some of the elders told her to stop asking, told her some knowledge isn't meant for outsiders, especially not to be written down in university papers. Marcus ducked under a massive fallen log. She didn't listen. Last anyone saw her, she was heading up toward the old growth near Hoh Lake. Said she'd found references to a specific site in some historical accounts from the 1890s. They hiked for 3 hours, moving deeper into terrain where the trees grew impossibly large and the silence felt thick enough to touch. Rob's GPS showed they were following Lauren's last known route based on her journal entries. The trail grew fainter, more overgrown. Eventually, Marcus stopped and pointed upward. "Found her pack up there yesterday," he said. "Climbers retrieved it." Rob looked up and felt his first flicker of unease. A blue day pack hung from a branch at least 40 feet off the ground, wedged in the fork of an ancient Sitka spruce. How did it get up there? That's what we'd like to know. No climbing equipment on her gear list. No signs of anyone else in the area. Marcus's voice was carefully neutral. Could have been a bear, theoretically. They sometimes drag things up trees. Rob studied the tree. No claw marks on the bark, no disturbance of the moss and lichen coating the trunk. But you don't think it was a bear? I don't know what to think, but there's more. Marcus led him 50 yards off the trail to a small clearing where the ferns had been trampled down. Someone had arranged stones in a spiral pattern, approximately 8 feet across. In the center sat Lauren's digital camera, recording light blinking despite 6 days of exposure to the elements. Rob's journalist instincts overrode his skepticism. This was evidence. He photographed the scene from multiple angles before carefully bagging the camera. Has anyone reviewed the footage? Rangers pulled the memory card. Couldn't watch more than a few minutes before. Marcus trailed off. Before what? Before it got too strange. They sent it to the FBI field office in Seattle. Haven't heard back. Marcus looked uncomfortable. There's also her audio recorder, still running when we found it. 7 hours of recordings from that night. Rob felt a familiar thrill. This was exactly the kind of elaborate setup he'd exposed dozens of times. Someone, maybe Lauren herself, maybe a hoaxer, had staged this scene. The impossibly placed backpack, the functioning electronics, the cryptic stone pattern. It was theater. I need to hear those recordings. Marcus handed him a small digital recorder. Copied them last night. Against protocol, but he shrugged. Her parents deserve answers. Rob put in his earbuds and pressed play. For the first hour, it was mundane field recording. Lauren's voice narrating her observations about the site, the positioning of petroglyphs she'd found carved into stone outcroppings nearby. She sounded excited, professional. Then, around the 90-minute mark, her tone changed. The symbols here don't match any published records of Coast Salish art. They're older, much older, and they're arranged in a very specific pattern that corresponds to descriptions of SXWexWe transformation sites I found in Father Durieux's private letters from 1892. He called them devil dances, but the Lummi elder I interviewed said they were doorways, places where the boundary between our world and something else grew thin. Rob rolled his eyes. Typical anthropologist getting swept up in romantic notions about ancient mysteries. He fast-forwarded, hearing Lauren set up her tent, start a fire, eat dinner. Normal camping sounds. Then, around hour 4, her voice again, but different, frightened. There's something out there, something big. I can hear it moving through the trees, but it's not moving like an animal. It's too deliberate, too aware. And there's a smell, like rot and cedar and something else. Something old. More silence. Then sounds that made Rob's skin prickle despite himself. Heavy footsteps. Not the padding of bare paws, but distinct thuds like something walking upright. And breathing. Deep, rasping breathing that sounded wrong. Too wet, too labored. Lauren's whisper. Oh God, it's huge. It's looking at me. How is it looking at me? It doesn't have eyes, it has... The recording dissolved into static, then screaming. Not the scream of someone startled or in pain, but a sound of pure existential terror. The kind of scream that comes from confronting something the human mind isn't equipped to process. It lasted for 37 seconds. Rob timed it. Then silence again. Then sounds he couldn't identify. Wet, tearing sounds in a voice that definitely wasn't Lauren's, chanting in a language he didn't recognize. When the recording ended, Rob found his hands were shaking. He steadied them with effort. Sound effects, he said aloud. She was creating an audio drama. Maybe for her research, maybe she was planning to... But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He'd heard fear before, real fear. And what was on that recording was genuine. Marcus was watching him carefully. There's one more thing. The symbols she photographed, the ones on the stones. I had a cousin look at them. He's been initiated into some of the traditional societies. He wouldn't tell me what they said, but he told me to leave the area immediately. Said whoever carved those symbols was calling something, specifically calling Tsonokwa. Tsonokwa? Rob was already pulling out his phone, trying to get a signal to research it. Nothing. No service this deep in the forest. Wild woman of the woods. Different tribes have different names. Zunukwa, Disonokwa. She's a giant, a cannibal. Takes children who wander too far from home, carries them away in her basket. The old stories say she makes a sound like this. Marcus made a low humming sound that somehow carried a note of hunger. And that sound means you're being hunted. Rob felt obligated to push back. You're talking about a fairy tale. A cautionary story to keep kids from wandering off. Maybe. Marcus started walking back toward the trail. But my great-grandmother saw one when she was a girl, 1947, up near Lake Ozette. She never told that story without crying. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Rob's place? Rob spent that night in the ranger station, reviewing Lauren's photographs on his laptop. The images were extraordinary. Ancient petroglyphs carved into basalt outcroppings depicting figures that weren't quite human. Tall, elongated beings with skeletal features and gaping mouths. Some carried baskets on their backs. Others seemed to be transforming, their bodies caught between human and something else. But it was the final photos that disturbed him most. They showed the stone circle, but in these images, there was something standing in the center. The camera's flash had caught it mid-motion, creating a blur that suggested enormous size and impossible proportions. Rob enhanced the image, sharpening the details, and felt his throat constrict. Whatever it was at least 8 feet tall. The body structure was humanoid but wrong. Arms too long, torso too broad, head oddly shaped. And though the face was blurred, there seemed to be something in its expression, something that spoke of vast intelligence and vaster hunger. He checked the image metadata, not photoshopped, no signs of digital manipulation. The timestamp showed it was taken at 11:47 p.m., roughly the same time Lauren's screaming began on the audio recording. Rob closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes. There had to be an explanation. Someone was hoaxing this, creating an elaborate mystery. Maybe Lauren was part of it. Maybe she'd partnered with locals to create a viral mystery. Maybe. His rationalization was interrupted by a sound from outside. That humming. Low, resonant, carrying an edge of terrible appetite. The same sound Marcus had made, but deeper, more real. Rob went to the window. The forest beyond the ranger station was utterly dark, the trees barely visible against the night sky. But something was moving out there. Something enormous, shifting between the ancient trunks with unnatural fluidity. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his journalist's instinct overriding common sense. Hello, Lauren? If this is a performance piece, it's very impressive, but... The humming stopped. In the sudden silence, Rob heard his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, from the darkness beyond his flashlight's reach, a voice spoke in rough, clicking syllables that might have been Lushootseed, the Salish language of the region. Swalshootsid, Guan emas kuti anremas. Rob didn't understand the words, but their meaning crashed into his mind anyway. Stranger. Why are you looking for what you should not find? His flashlight flickered, dimmed, died. In the moment before it went out completely, the beam caught something at the edge of the clearing. A face, if it could be called that, emerging from behind a massive cedar. Sunken eyes that reflected no light. A mouth stretched too wide. Features that seemed carved from rotting wood and shadow. Rob ran. He ran back into the ranger station, slammed the door, turned every lock. His hands fumbled with his cell phone, but there was still no signal. The satellite phone in the emergency kit required line of sight to the sky, and he wasn't going back outside. He spent the night pressed against the interior wall, listening to sounds circling the building. Heavy footsteps, the scrape of something massive dragging against the exterior walls, and that humming rising and falling like a lullaby sung by something that had forgotten how to be human. When dawn finally came, Rob emerged to find deep gouges in the station's log walls, as if something had tested their strength with claws the size of railroad spikes. In the mud near the door, A single footprint, 18 inches long, broader than any bear's, with 5 distinct toe impressions that looked almost human. Marcus arrived at 7 a.m. and stopped dead when he saw Rob's face. "You heard it. I saw it." The words came out hollow. "Marcus, I've spent my entire career proving this stuff isn't real. I've exposed hundreds of frauds. This can't be." But it is. Marcus examined the claw marks. "Tsonoqua. You got her attention by coming here, by looking for Lauren. She's claimed this territory now. The symbols Lauren found and photographed, they weren't just markers. They were a summoning, an invitation, and Lauren accepted it, whether she understood that or not." Rob's mind was fracturing, his entire worldview crumbling. People don't just vanish because of folklore. There has to be a rational explanation. A person in a costume, an elaborate hoax, something. Then explain the backpack 40 feet up a tree. Explain Lauren's camera still recording after 6 days in the rain. Explain the footprints, the recordings, what you saw last night. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "Rob, I've read your articles. You're smart, you're thorough, but you've made a career out of not seeing what's right in front of you because you decided it couldn't exist. That's not skepticism. That's denial." The words hit harder than any supernatural terror. Rob had prided himself on his rationality. But was it rationality or just inflexibility? An inability to accept that his understanding of the world might be incomplete? "What do I do?" The question came out small, defeated. If this thing is real, if it has Lauren, then she's gone, taken into Tsonoqua's world. The old stories say there's no coming back from that. Marcus paused. Unless what? Unless someone follows the old ways, makes the right offerings, speaks the right words, performs the transformation dance. Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable. But that knowledge isn't given freely, and it's dangerous. The dancers who call on spirit power sometimes don't come back themselves. They get lost in the other world, or they come back, changed. Rob thought about Lauren's parents, about their desperate hope that their daughter might still be alive. He thought about his career, built on mockery and superiority. He thought about the thing he'd seen in the darkness, and the terrible understanding that the universe was far stranger and more dangerous than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. "Take me to someone who knows the rituals," he said. The elder lived 2 hours away, on the Maka reservation. Her name was Grace Talat, and she was 93 years old with eyes that looked like they'd seen through to the bones of the world. She listened to Rob's story without interruption, her gnarled hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. "The anthropologist girl came to me," she finally said, 3 weeks ago. "Asked about the winter dances, the Sex Wakes Way Society, the transformation rituals. I told her no, told her those things aren't for outsiders, especially not to be written down for universities. She got angry, said knowledge should be free, that keeping traditions secret was how they die." Grace shook her head. She didn't understand. Some knowledge is kept secret because it's dangerous, because it opens doors that should stay closed. "Can you help me?" Rob asked. "Can you tell me how to find Lauren?" "I can tell you how to walk between worlds, how to face Tsonoqua and bargain for what she's taken, but it will cost you." Grace's eyes pinned him. "The spirits demand payment. To enter their world, you must leave something of yourself behind. Your certainty, your understanding of what's real, maybe your sanity, maybe your life. Still want to go?" Rob thought of the recording, of Lauren's screams. He thought of the mockery he'd heaped on people who believed in things they couldn't explain. He thought of his father who died believing his house was haunted, whom Rob had dismissed as senile. "Yes," he said, "tell me what to do." Grace instructed him with precise detail. He would need to return to the stone circle at dusk. He would need to bring offerings, cedar bark, salmon oil, red ochre. He would need to mark his face with the symbols she drew for him, symbols that looked disturbingly similar to the ones in Lauren's photographs. And he would need to say the words, the invitation, the challenge. When you enter her world, time won't work right, Grace warned. You might be there for minutes that feel like days, or days that feel like minutes. The forest you know will be there, but different, older, more awake. And Sonequa will know you're coming. She'll test you, try to understand if you're food or if you're something else. Something else like what? Like someone who respects the old ways, who understands that humans aren't the only things with power in these woods. Grace handed him a small carved figure, a miniature cedar mask with an expression of fierce determination. This is Kwekwe, the Transformer. Keep it with you. It might help you remember who you are when everything else gets confused. Rob returned to Olympic National Park as the afternoon light began to fail. Marcus had given him one last warning at the trailhead. If you're not back by dawn, I'm not coming after you. Can't risk it. The forest protects its own, and you're not one of them. The hike to the stone circle felt different this time. The forest seemed to watch him, ancient trees leaning in as he passed. He heard sounds in the undergrowth, not animals, but something else, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. By the time he reached the clearing, his nerves were screaming at him to run, but he stayed. He arranged the offerings in the pattern Grace had shown him. He marked his face with ochre, the symbols burning against his skin like brands. And as the last light faded from the sky, he spoke the words in Lushootseed that Grace had taught him. Gwan namasti, anramas. Kyo, usid chalti, di akti I. Hey swadix wited chadti I. I am looking for what was taken. I come as a seeker, not an enemy. I will walk your path. The forest went silent. Completely silent. No wind, no insects, no distant birds. The air grew thick, heavy with a presence that pressed against Rob's skin like cold water. And then the humming began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest. The stone circle beneath his feet began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, lines of light connecting each stone in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The trees around the clearing seemed to stretch taller, their trunks becoming pillars holding up a sky that was suddenly filled with stars he'd never seen before. Constellations that formed shapes of running figures and gaping mouths. Rob felt the transformation begin. The world he knew was sliding away, replaced by something older, something that existed alongside the familiar forest, but on a different frequency. Colors shifted into ranges his eyes shouldn't be able to perceive. Sounds contained meanings beyond their acoustic properties. The distinction between his body and the forest around him began to blur. And then she was there. Sonequa stepped out from between two trees that hadn't existed a moment before, and Rob's mind recoiled from the sight of her. She was impossibly tall, 10 feet, 12 feet, growing larger as she approached. Her body was covered in thick, dark hair or fur that seemed to be made of shadow itself. Her face was a carved mask of wood and darkness, features frozen in an expression of eternal hunger. Eye sockets held embers instead of eyes. Her mouth gaped wide enough to swallow a man whole, revealing teeth like obsidian blades. She carried an enormous woven cedar basket on her back, and from within it Rob heard sounds, crying, moaning, voices calling out in languages dead for centuries. The humming grew louder, and Rob understood it now. It wasn't a sound, it was a question. Are you food? His entire body shook with primal terror. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, to abandon this insane quest and accept that some things couldn't be found. But he forced himself to stand still, to meet those ember eyes, to speak. I've come for Lauren Mitchell. She's mine to protect, and I claim her back. Sonequa's laugh was like rocks grinding together in an avalanche. When she spoke, her voice came from inside Rob's head, bypassing his ears entirely. Yours? The girl who violated our sacred places? Who took images of what should not be seen? Who spoke names that should not be spoken? The massive head tilted. She paid for her trespass. She feeds my hunger now. Why should I give her up to one who spent his life denying we exist? Rob felt the truth of her words like blows. He had denied, had mocked, had scorned, had built walls around his understanding of reality and defended them with arrogance. And now, facing something his rationality couldn't dismiss, he had no defense. "I was wrong," he said, and the admission felt like tearing out pieces of his identity. "I spent years not seeing because I was afraid. Afraid that if one impossible thing was real, then my entire understanding of the world would collapse. So I denied everything rather than admit I might be wrong about anything. And now your understanding has collapsed." Sonequa moved closer, her massive form blotting out the alien stars. "Now you stand in my world, small and confused, all your certainty stripped away. What makes you think I won't simply add you to my basket?" Rob's hand found the carved figure Grace had given him. Kwekwe, the transformer, the one who changed shape, who moved between worlds. He understood suddenly what Grace had been trying to tell him. Transformation wasn't just about going from one place to another. It was about becoming something new, about letting go of who you were to survive what came next. "Because I'm here to learn," he said, "because I'm willing to change." Lauren came with certainty, with academic arrogance. I'm coming with nothing, with the understanding that I know nothing. That's the difference. The ember eyes studied him. Time stretched. Rob felt himself aging, felt years passing in moments, or perhaps only seconds that felt like years. Grace was right. Time didn't work properly here. Finally, Sonequa reached into her basket. What she pulled out wasn't Lauren, at least not the Lauren from the photographs Rob had studied. This woman was thinner, paler, her eyes holding depths they hadn't possessed before. She moved like someone who'd forgotten how gravity worked, her gestures slow and uncertain. "She has walked in my world," Sonequa said. "She can't fully return to yours. Part of her will always remain here, always hunger as I hunger, always see what you cannot see. This is the price of violation. Do you accept this burden?" Rob looked at Lauren, saw the profound change in her, understood that whatever he brought back wouldn't be the woman who'd disappeared, but he also saw she was alive, aware, still essentially herself despite the transformation. "I accept," he said. Sonequa's laugh echoed across dimensions. "Then learn this, denier of truths. Your world and mine occupy the same space. We are the same forest, the same stones, the same darkness. You simply chose not to see, but now you cannot unsee. You will walk in both worlds for the rest of your days. You will hunger as I hunger, not for flesh but for understanding. And you will teach others that certainty is the enemy of truth." The massive hand reached out, and one claw-tipped finger touched Rob's forehead. Pain exploded through his skull, searing and absolute. He felt something fundamental break inside him, some wall that had separated rational from irrational, possible from impossible. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in the stone circle under a normal Olympic sky, gray with approaching dawn. Lauren lay beside him, breathing but unconscious. And Rob knew with terrible certainty that he would never be able to return to the life he'd known. He'd spent years insisting the world made sense, that everything had an explanation. Now he knew better. The world was vast and strange and filled with powers that didn't care about human understanding. His career as a debunker was over. He couldn't go back to mocking what he now knew was real. Marcus found them 2 hours later. He took one look at Rob's face and nodded, understanding without words what had happened. They carried Lauren down the mountain, and by the time they reached the ranger station, she was awake and speaking, though her words were disjointed, mixing English with Lushootseed and languages that had no names. The official report said Lauren had experienced a psychotic episode brought on by dehydration and exposure, that she'd created the elaborate scene as a result of academic stress and cultural appropriation guilt, that Rob had found her wandering the forest in a confused state. Rob didn't contradict the report. What was the point? He'd spent 12 years convincing people the supernatural didn't exist. He couldn't undo that with one story, especially not one that made him sound insane. But he deleted his blog, stopped taking cases, started researching folklore and mythology, not to debunk but to understand. He learned Lushootseed, spent time with tribal elders, listening instead of interrogating, and every few months he returned to Olympic National Park, to the stone circle, to leave offerings. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, he heard the humming, a reminder that he'd walked between worlds, that he'd bargained with something older than civilization, that his certainty had been shattered and could never be rebuilt. Lauren recovered in her own way. She abandoned academia but became an advocate for indigenous rights, for the preservation of sacred sites, for the understanding that some knowledge wasn't meant to be captured and categorized. She and Rob stayed in contact, two people who'd seen beyond the veil and could never quite fit back into the world they'd left. On the anniversary of that October night, Rob received a package. Inside was a small carved figure, not Kwekwe this time, but a miniature Sonokwa, her mouth open in that eternal hungry grin. No note, but he understood the message. He was marked now, changed. A skeptic who'd learned the hardest lesson, that the most dangerous lie wasn't believing in impossible things, but refusing to believe in anything beyond what you'd already decided was true. The world was vast and strange and beautiful and terrifying, and certainty, his old friend, his armor, his identity, was just another word for blindness. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?